Sailing Out of Darkness, Carolina Coast, Volume 4, written by Normandie Fischer, narrated by Laura Jennings. Chapter 1. Samantha. Black night's emptiness. The bed reeks of nothing. Cuckoo sings the melody, but no one hears. Samantha Ransom smoothed her palm across the silky sheet, stopping when she touched a feathered mass of pillow. Just that movement roused a whiff of Jack's aftershave, along with traces of sweat and man, and memories flashed of his touch, of his fingers, oh, and of his kisses. They danced in her head unbidden, unwanted. On a moan, she tossed the pillow to the floor and pressed a fist against the wrench in her gut. The sound oozed from her belly, growing louder as it hit the air. Long minutes passed before her cries quieted to ragged breaths. She kicked free of the tangled top sheet and waited for a sleep that would not come. The minutes became hours as the cuckoo in her old clock intoned their loss. Something crunched on the gravel outside her open window, sending her heartbeats thump to double time. She balled her fists. An intruder would give her something to fight against, instead of this self she couldn't control. But no one came. The silence echoed off the walls, reminding her of childhood nights when she'd bit her lip and squeezed shut her eyes to keep the bad away. "Let it go," she whispered now. At the first gray of dawn, she eased out of bed, snatched at the sheets and let them lie in a heap on the floor, as she took her used body into the bathroom. Climbing in the shower, she tried to scour away the night and her misery with a lavender body wash. The unscrubbable followed her to the laundry room, where she stuffed the sheets in the washer and turned the water temperature to hot. It settled on her as she ground coffee beans and placed the kettle on to boil. Samantha's, her coffee kitchen shop, was closed today. Church would happen all up and down the noose, but she wouldn't be there. Not today. Not this week. Not when her chest blazed its scarlet A, and God seemed unfound. Silent. She wandered the downstairs rooms, waiting for inspiration, for something that would occupy her hands and perhaps her thoughts. She'd vacuumed, dusted, and polished during yesterday's storm. She didn't want to cook or pull weeds. Perhaps she'd tackle her little boat's bright work. The rain had kept her from sanding the mahogany on the centerboard trunk or touching up those peeling spots of varnish on the bowsprit. Besides, working on the Alice too always calmed her spirit. Leaving the coffee untouched, she donned her grubbies and headed toward the river. The wind lay still. The sky shimmered a light blue as the sun rose higher in a day that ought to hold some joy. With one hand on the rail that led down the bank, she glanced at the dock and squinted as she looked again, because it couldn't be. Her boat's mast listed a good 30 degrees to port. Dashing down the short flight of steps, Sam tried to grasp the hawse, let alone the wise. She always left enough slack in the lines to compensate for the rise and fall of the tide, unless she'd been careless when she'd last secured the boat, because of those other things on her mind. Alice strained against the dock. Thank heaven Sam had tied off the boom so it wasn't dipping over the left side, adding its weight to the rest. The bailing bucket, lines, and a sponge slopped around in a cockpit half filled with water. Her pulse beat a jitterbug as she knelt and leaned out and over. Nothing there. Perhaps forward? Lying on her belly on the hard wooden dock, she stretched to check under the raised gunwale near her. And there they were, a series of small holes just below what would normally have been the waterline. At each indentation, starburst cracks in the boat's interior gel coat radiated outward. She pushed herself up, studying the outside of the hull to be certain Alice hadn't hit barnacles or rubbed against a piling. But that wouldn't explain the starburst cracks. Those meant someone had stabbed from inside the cockpit. Thank God she'd messed up the dock lines, tightening them instead of leaving them loose enough for tidal changes. If she'd cleated them properly, any holes below the waterline would have sunk Alice. Whoever had poked those holes hadn't expected the short lines and the very low tide to keep the boat lopsided instead of at the bottom of the river. Sam wanted to weep, but no tears came. She felt like retching, but what good would that do? About as much as railing aloud to an empty river. The name flashed. India Monroe. It must have been India. She saw again India's face, the binoculars dangling from her neck as Sam and Jack sailed back to the dock. She felt again the hurt when Jack leapt from the boat and went to India's side to escort his old girlfriend away from his new girlfriend's boat. He'd phoned Sam after he'd settled India at home, after he'd soothed or somethinged India. What was it? Only days ago? It felt like years. "We're through," Sam had told him then, her voice full of the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "This isn't working. I can't see you anymore." "You don't mean that." Jack hadn't even pretended to believe her. Instead, he'd smiled behind his words, hadn't he, resurrecting a half-forgotten image of Jack the boy, not taking her seriously, and of herself, 2 years younger, stamping her feet at him. She'd curled her toes and banged her frustration. "I do. This time, I do." "We've been through this, Sam, honey. I'm not with India anymore. You know that. I don't live there. It's you I love. It's you I need." Why couldn't he see? "I can't be the person who makes another woman hurt like that. Imagine what she saw through those binoculars." Sam bit back a moan that wanted to climb right out of her belly. Memories of what they'd done, of what India might have witnessed. "It's wrong," she finally said. "We're wrong." India's pain was only half of it, the smaller half. Still, it was obviously the half that had holed Sam's boat. But neither India's pain nor her disgust at herself had stopped Sam from opening the door to Jack. She always opened to him. A gull squawked and waddled at the end of the dock. With the tide coming in, she had to do something about those holes before the rising water loosened the lines and let the river sink her precious boat. Sam found another bucket and line in the shed and prepared to bail. But no, she needed to fill the holes first, because an emptied Alice would bob upright, putting those holes underwater. Into the bucket went epoxy, hardener, filler, and fiberglass cloth, along with sandpaper, thick gloves, solvent, tape, and a roll of paper towels. From her awkward position on the dock, stretching out and leaning over to sand and clean the area, the prep work took hours. By the time she'd mixed and slathered on thickened epoxy, and added a layer of fiberglass cloth for strength, patches of her skin were rubbed raw, and a few seldom-used muscles screamed for relief. The repair job wasn't pretty, but at least it would keep the water out. If only she could patch her own self as easily. Jack's words when she phoned to tell him about Alice set her teeth on edge. "It's got to be kids. Though I admit this is getting way out of hand." Why wouldn't he admit it might be about them? "Jack, really? You know it's not kids. Besides, the fact that none live nearby, why would anyone randomly pick me as a target? Again?" She waited for him to get it, and finally spoke into the silent phone. "What about calling the sheriff?" "Sure. Maybe he can figure this out. In the meantime, you want me to send someone over to mend the boat?" "Like you did when my tires were flat and my screen slashed?" "I'd come myself," he said. "But I told you, I'm heading out of town in about an hour. All goes well, I should be back next Sunday." "I've already patched Alice's holes." She kept her tone flat instead of the round and mad that stayed just out of reach. "Well, good." "Jack?" Her voice had pancaked to the point that the stupidest person should have been able to see she was on the brink, and Jack wasn't stupid. "What?" What did he mean, what? "You need to speak to India," she said. "She's the only one with a motive." Honey, she wouldn't. Look, I've known India Monroe for 10 years. She's got issues, but I can't imagine her hurting you or anyone else. Then you're naive. His loud sigh made her want to kick something. She'd have used his shins if he'd been nearby. Fine. I'll call her. Hold off on the sheriff. I will for now, but you need to tell her that won't last, and don't forget to assure her we won't be seeing each other anymore. Maybe that'll get her to leave me alone. I can't say that, because you know it's not true. It has to be. This time it has to be. 3 strikes and you're out. She'd had her 3, and more. I'll talk to her, but I'll also see you when I get back. He didn't wait for her answer. Sam stared at the silent phone and slowly set it down. How had this disconnect happened? She said the words. He talked right over her and then walked right in. But could she blame him? Even the mess with her screens hadn't stiffened her spine enough for her to bar the door. She glanced over her shoulder at the back porch. It had been another morning like this one, sun-drenched and clear. She'd padded into the kitchen to the scent of fresh brew and filled her mug before heading to the porch to welcome the day. She could still feel the burn from the sloshed coffee on her wrist and fingers. Someone had ripped down her screens. No, not ripped. Sliced. Knifed. She'd set her mug on an inside table, dabbed her hand on her bathrobe to dry it, and stepped out. Boards had creaked under her feet, but she'd focused on one particular section of screen, where the red letters of half a word still hung straight, leaving a B and an I. Flopped toward the floor had been 3 more, their shapes distorted by the folds of dangling mesh, but still guessable. She hadn't wanted to touch them, or touch anything at all. The corner of a chair had hit her thigh as she'd backed away. Stumbling, she'd grabbed the wall, turned, and fled, locking the door behind her. Now, on this morning of regret, she pictured blonde hair surrounding a face contorted with anger. The sting of tears replaced the slamming of heart against ribs. Because she'd known, then and now. Only one person hated her enough to wreak such damage. Gray obscured the room when she woke the next morning, as if cataracts fogged her lenses. She rubbed her eyes to clear them and climbed from bed. The cuckoo in the hall reminded her it was time to get a move on. Work waited. The world waited. She showered, dressed, and applied armor before she faced town. A dab of concealer under her eyes, a heavy application of blush, and a flick of waterproof mascara. She pulled a turquoise silk shirt off a hanger, slipped into black slacks and black flats, and added a pair of small gold hoops. She packed a salad for lunch. Samantha's offered baked goodies for those who came in looking for a tall cup, or who wanted new knives or blenders, or a cookbook so they could stir-fry in their new wok. Maybe she needed fattening, but not with espresso brownies, because she couldn't help thinking that once she got started, she wouldn't be able to quit. And today was not the day to get started. Not unless she wanted to turn into her daddy's cousin Lulu, who'd blimped to 368 pounds when her husband ran off with his boyfriend. One brownie at a time had segued into 1 cake at a time, and then 2 cakes plus a gallon of ice cream. Lulu had died of heart failure before she hit 49. Maybe Sam's heart hadn't yet been completely shattered like Lulu's, but it surely had fissures big enough to leak the life right out. And she'd carved a slew of them herself. Still, she had both of her shops, the first of which she'd built from nothing before the coffee house craze hit Raleigh. The second, post-Greg, a little closer to home. And she had her beautiful little sailboat, along with her newly restored cottage, and, of course, the twins plus 1.5. Lulu'd had no one. Not even her cousin. That 1.5 still took some getting used to. She liked her daughter-in-law and the prospect of that new life Cindy carried. But it wasn't so very long ago that Daniel and his twin sister Steffi had been children on top of each other and her, their voices echoing, the thump-thump of their music swelling until it almost burst the walls of the house they'd all shared in Raleigh. Sometimes, when fixing breakfast for herself, she imagined the twins sitting behind her, begging for waffles. "Please, Mom, just one more." Her once-upon-a-time babies had morphed overnight, one into a husband and soon a father, and the other, her sweet girl, into a design student in Florence, Italy. They were barely 22. Sam could feel wrinkles sagging her arms, her neck, her world. She was almost a grandmother. Soon, she'd need bifocals, a walker, a wheelchair. That image provoked a bark of laughter. "Get over yourself," she said, scrubbing harder at a splatter of oil on the counter. Clouds darkened the sky as she finished putting away her lunch fixings, and the first spatters of rain hit the gravel as she headed out of her driveway and into Beaufort. Good thing she'd fixed Alice's holes before the rains returned. Sam beat a tattoo on the steering wheel and timed the slosh of her wipers. She ought to get the radio fixed, or put in a CD player. She'd scheduled another training session for her Beaufort assistant, Tootie, on some of the software both shops used. And Rhea was supposed to call with a report from the Raleigh Samanthas at 10. Her morning would be busy. Busy was good. Busy might keep her from... what? Calling the sheriff? Banging her head against the wall? By closing time, Sam barely had energy to get herself home, like a horse that had been ridden hard and put away wet. "Yeah, right," she told her Toyota. "I'm more like wrung out and hung up wet, and I'll be wetter if this rain doesn't slow." She picked up a ready-made spinach salad and an already roasted chicken at the grocery store, along with a loaf of freshly baked multigrain, and headed home, where she found a voicemail from Jack. "Missing you. I'll be back Sunday if all goes well. I love you." He loved her, but he hadn't mentioned speaking to India. He loved her, but he wouldn't stay away when she begged him to. Well, of course not. Why should he believe she meant it? She stabbed at her salad and tried to chew a bite that included greens and a chunk of goat cheese. It needed more salt, pepper, something. She sipped her wine, which should have mellowed her, shouldn't it? When the phone rang, she jumped but let it go to voicemail. Another sip, another stab, and curiosity propelled her to check the message. It was Rhea's voice this time saying, "We need to talk." Sam hit the call button. "You rang?" "I did," Rhea said. "Honey, you didn't sound so good today. Oh, I know you didn't mean to let me hear it, but this is me, remember?" Sam picked up her glass and carried it to the couch, sliding down against a fluffy pillow. She sighed. "Oh, Rhea, it's bad." "Tell me." "I found holes in Alice yesterday. Looked like an ice pick had made them." "You thinking what I'm thinking? That it's the old girlfriend up to her tricks?" "Who else?" "So why'd she come after you this time? I thought you'd shuffle that man all the way out of your life." Sam twirled the wine in her glass, but she couldn't bring herself to drink, or to speak. "You didn't. Oh, honey, I told you what you gotta do." Rhea had. Rhea had been steadfast when Sam's Raleigh church friends had sent worried looks and cold shoulders, as if her divorce were catching. So, of course, Sam had clung to Rhea's friendship, and Big Mouth Sam had told Rhea all about meeting up with her childhood best friend, Jack, about him working on her house, about how fun it was to play on Alice with Jack. It hadn't taken Rhea long to jab her finger on the tabletop when Sam had visited Raleigh. "Honey, you gotta flee." Then those fingers had fluttered in a little wave, as if to shoo Sam out the door. "The Lord's really clear on this, you hear? Temptation like that, you gotta run fast as those legs of yours will carry you." She'd said it more than once and she'd learned the truth. But in the beginning of the mess, the voice in Sam's head had whispered contrary messages like, "You can do it. You're strong. Just say no." Who'd ever come up with that platitude? Just say no. Sure, right, great idea, and workable for a saint, which Sam obviously wasn't. No, Rhea's had been the better advice. Hightail it out of Dodge. I know, Sam said. I wish I'd listened. So, now what? What do you mean, now what? I've made a mess of things. Her voice quavered. She didn't want to cry again. That's all she seemed to do these days when Rhea called to check on her. Rhea was the one who knew all. Girl, are you closing off again? Sam didn't answer. You stop that, right now. It's so hard. I want to be good, I do. Well, honey, you tell me how you're going to do that right there in that town with him. A man you trusted, 'cause he was your buddy way back when. And after all that mess with Greg. I know. So now what? You already asked that. I did, but you didn't answer. How could she? She hadn't a clue. You said flee. But that's not an option. I mean, I've got 2 shops and a house and a boat. And now I'm a grandmother-to-be. Rhea hooted. Sam pulled the phone away and stared at it. What's so funny about that? That baby's not coming for a long time. And you think you're indispensable at the shops? You think you haven't trained me and that girl, Tootie, to do just fine without you hanging over our shoulders? What's gotten into you? You've got Steffi studying in Italy, right there in that beautiful country. And don't you try to tell me you can't afford to go visit her. Sam pulled up her knees and hugged them to her chest. She hadn't even considered traveling. And to Italy. Oh my. I've always wanted to see Rome, Florence, and on a whisper, Venice? You think I don't know that? How many times did you tell me that fool husband of yours promised to take you? You think I wasn't counting? That I didn't see your face time and again when he disappointed you? Dropping her feet to the floor and letting out a breath from deep in her gut, Sam nodded to the room and to her glass of wine, which she tilted to her lips. The dark liquid slid down her throat. Maybe it would help her decide what to do. You think it's really possible? She asked, her voice smaller than she'd heard it in a while. That I could leave everything? Honey, it's not just possible. It's a got to do. And you think Tootie could manage without me? Why not? I'll only be a couple of hours away. I can help her with the bookkeeping and payroll. Didn't you say you'd hired a part-timer? Her fiancé's older sister. I told you about Holland, the banker. And how's that working out? Sam laughed. We'll see, won't we? At least Holland's a good foot taller than his sister. He can stand at Tootie's back if she needs him. This time Rhea's laugh loosed humor. So you go on and buy yourself a ticket. Get healed and free. The idea settled, took hold and started to bud. I'll try. Good. Now you call me with the details soon as you make them, here? Thank you. No need to thank me. You just come back whole enough not to need some man to fill in the gaps. Yes, ma'am. Sam disconnected and wandered outside to the top of the cliff. The rain had stopped, and the sun eased below the horizon, throwing everything in shadow. Alice bobbed below, salvaged, but not yet beautiful. If she left, someone else would have to take care of finishing that job. Or maybe she'd just haul her boat in for the season. Was leaving really possible? She turned on her heel and headed inside to her computer. She'd just check on fares and schedules, find out how much she had in her savings account, how much she could spare. For healing. Did ex-wives and ex-lovers attend some sort of 12-step program? Or did they just evolve and explore until they found new ways to cope? New words to define themselves after all the old ones failed. Maybe this could be her Betty Ford clinic abroad. Chapter 2. Teo. Lonely isn't lonely if one looks from outside in. It's just the inside out, that makes a person feel so thin. Theodore Anderson clawed his way up the bank, grabbing handholds and pressing against rock with his bare feet. Why wouldn't his legs work? Come on, move, move. Kicking only tightened the bindings around his ankles. At his thighs. What was wrong with him? The Hulk skidded along the asphalt. Tires shrieked and air brakes hissed as the engine howled in protest. Teo turned. The massive silver grille reflected oncoming headlights, blinding him, and all he could do was raise his arms to protect his face, because he was too late. He'd never escape. And, dying, he woke. He inhaled slowly, letting the breath whoosh out between pursed lips. He was in his room, wrapped in a sheet. No demons roamed, and, while that truck may have jackknifed years ago and thousands of miles away, it was not here, in Reggio sul Mare, on the Italian Riviera. So why the dream now, and in this place? He tossed off the covers, slipped on a pair of jeans and a shirt, and slid his feet into loafers. He couldn't run off the tension, but he could walk. The tap of his cane on the sidewalk echoed in the pre-dawn. Like eyelids closed against the night, metal shutters hid the shop windows. He could picture the butchers just there, slabs of meat hanging from hooks, fowl complete with head and feet, prices by the kilo. He passed the greengrocer's, 2 stores down. Next, the Tabacayo, which reminded him that he needed to buy stamps when they opened. He knew the shopkeepers by sight after 5 years of walking these streets, even if he didn't know all by name. In the distance, an engine revved. Most in town would stretch and yawn as they slowly woke. The bakers, though, were even now sliding dough into ovens, yeasty morsels he could buy in a few hours to nibble with strong espresso. But not yet. His tap-tap continued down the hill to the shore, where he stepped onto the rocky sand and rebalanced. Waves crested and broke, hidden by the fog, though lights from the nearby hotel illuminated enough beach to keep him from falling. He kicked off his shoes and moved to the water's edge, then whispered, "Sono qui." That elicited a smile. "I am here," he repeated. Not there. No longer there. "Okay, I'm up and out." He aimed his message skyward. "I assume that's what you or someone wanted." The sea wrapped his ankles and splashed the tip of his cane. The walk had cleared his soggy brain, and the eerie quiet of a mist-clad sea sat well with him. He stood still and listened to the soft slosh as the waves hit sand, but no one spoke, neither God nor man. He'd begun to turn away, when she stepped out of the fog, white on white with a touch of gray, followed by a flash of light skin and dark hair. Puzzled, he stared. Slowly, her form emerged, and a bright smile bridged the dimensions. She beckoned. Did she wave at him? Teo peered over his shoulder and down the beach, but he was alone with only the sand and the sea, and this vision before him. He expected to hear witchy moans next, or see a bubbling cauldron. Surely this wasn't an angel. "Che succede?" he called, wanting to know what was up, along with a why or two. But she didn't speak. Perhaps she couldn't. The sea sucked the wave, as if the sand inhaled then exhaled, breathing in water and filtering it out like a fish's gills. He backed away, sliding damp feet into his shoes. Lights from the new hotel, the Albergo dei Romantici, illuminated the froth, showing off upturned rowboats that lined the sand, like an army slumbering till day. Teo rarely ventured close to the developed boardwalks, but at this hour it seemed appropriate. No one else stirred. He was free to explore. This stranger's appearance wouldn't seem so odd if she had flesh and form that he could touch. Instead, she shape-shifted in the half-light, one moment showing no more than a wispy outline, in the next, substance. There, now, a 3-dimensional image. She didn't possess Sofrina's soft curves or that long, wavy hair. Her lips eased without seduction, an art she didn't seem to know. Her lashes lowered, but not to shadow Sofrina's penetrating stare. They dropped to hide her pain. How could he know that? He shook his head, puzzled when the understanding dropped into his mind with no prompting from either of them. His eyes snapped closed, then opened to scan the area. Perhaps he was merely dreaming. A pleasant dream to make him forget the nightmare. His mind playing tricks. He kicked the sand, then scored a trench with his cane. The effect seemed too real for a dream. Besides, a dreamscape normally stopped and rewound before either repeating the sequence or adding some new element. Why did his sleep-deprived brain conjure this woman, whose image he didn't recognize? He'd left his bed, full of the need to walk. He should return and hope for rest. Right, as long as this haunting didn't follow him into sleep. Someone laughed from around a corner. A second hushed the first. These two may have been the only others yet abroad this night, their voices echoing in streets, silent except for Teo's tap-tap shuffle as he headed home. He leaned heavily on his cane. The damp had crept in, knife-like to his bones. Unlocking and pushing open the heavy outside door took energy, but the elevator to the penthouse floor chugged on its own, gears squeaking to drop him in the small foyer. He used a second key, and he was home, wishing his eyelids felt as heavy as his body did. His computer beckoned from across the room. Perhaps writing a line or two would make him drowsy enough for bed. He eased onto his desk chair, flipped the switch, and waited as the system booted up. His fingers dashed across the keyboard, trying to capture and keep the image. He ignored the grit in his eyes and the fatigue that hunched his shoulders as the letters grew into words. He saw her long before he met her. Ugh. He hit the backspace key, tried again. He dreamt her into being years before he saw her smile. Jab, jab, jab. His index finger shot the words off the screen. She had seemed so real. Why couldn't he find the words to begin? Surely she'd shown herself so he could create her, fit her into a story. He rolled his chair away from the keyboard, flicked up on the three-way switch and squinted at the screen. With a sigh, he backed the brilliance down again. It wasn't the light. Just because he made a career of recording Sofrina's antics, did that mean he couldn't branch out? Add a new heroine, or a hero this time? What was wrong with having a hero? Fine, he couldn't sell his first hero-laden story, but that was years ago. He closed his eyes and waited. And there she was, again showing herself. This new her, with dark hair wind-blown, and stabbing out behind her head from one of those silly things women wore to make a stubby ponytail. Why was she even out in the wind? Was she running? From whom? Her eyes hid behind dark glasses, until she doffed the tortoise-shell frames and smiled. They were deep brown eyes, reflecting hints of yellow. She was more striking than pretty, but that may have been her age. She was older than he, of course. Why, of course? He longed for a drink, a tumbler of lovely amber liquid that would slide down the throat and spread its warmth, its relaxing warmth, through his limbs. Right and straight to his brain, making it soggy and useless. No, he wouldn't touch anything more potent than a few sips of wine. A humorless laugh was all he could manage as he imagined life in Reggio, without at least that half-full glass of red near his plate, obviating the need to explain his past when someone tried to offer him more. The Italians either didn't have an alcohol problem, or it didn't worry them. His sigh, as he remembered how the liquor had dulled more than his physical pain, sounded loud in the room, because quitting didn't automatically erase the memories, or the occasional, all right, sometimes more than occasional, longing for oblivion. Hunger and the need to escape again assailed him, making him restless, fidgety. Shutting down his computer, he wandered to the window. The sky had brightened perceptibly. He slid his bare feet into shoes, grabbed his windbreaker and cane, and lumbered down the stairs and out the front door. The neighboring Tobacaya remained shuttered, But he heard noises from the bakery, smelled yeasty bread from the forno as he limped past. His cane clacked along the sidewalk. He picked up his pace, wanting to get to the sea before the sun slid up over the horizon. A Vespa scooted to a halt as he reached the corner. "Buongiorno, Teo. Cosa fai stamattina?" A grin revealed Nico's gleaming new teeth. Teo smiled back. What exactly was he doing? "Heading to the beach," he said, because at least that was a destination. "You off to work?" "Si. Adele wishes to see you. You come soon? We make a feast. Mangiamo insieme." "I will. You thank her. Tell her to pick a day." "Va bene, ciao." And the scooter zoomed off toward the hills. Teo watched until Nico vanished around a corner. Their chance encounter boded well for the day. So what if he had a bit of writer's block? He'd get over it. Without wind, the glassy surface of the Mediterranean caught the sun's flames and bounced them skyward. Teo watched the colors ease from purples to reds and yellows and oranges, blending shades of each in both the sky and sea. A few masts bobbed on a swell. Gulls squawked and cawed overhead. The sand kicked up under his loafers and cane as he wandered toward the town landing. An espresso called. An espresso and a bit of fresh bread. Perhaps the words hadn't formed yet, but hazy snapshots flicked into his mind, pieces of her image blinking behind the veil. Perhaps she would remain a mirage, but he certainly hoped not. He'd like to have something new to show his editor when he visited the States. Val prodded him to write another Sofrina mystery, but perhaps he could convince her to take on someone different. His elusive vision, especially if he didn't completely toss Sofrina to the wolves, but merely added a new twist, a new persona to his repertoire. He'd like to savor something new, a fresh taste on his lips, a different world. After all, he was a writer. He should be able to create worlds to inhabit, shouldn't he? Even if only for himself. Chapter 3. Samantha. Pilings chafe and barnacles rip at a body tossed on a word of truth. An owl hooted. Sam stopped packing and listened, knowing what would follow. At the mournful response and quick riposte, she sent up a prayer for wandering barn cats. She didn't want to imagine talons swooping to capture the unwary. The two birds of prey spoke in the night stillness, while she stood, a fistful of underwear clutched to her chest. Would she hear owls in Italy? Or be able to watch shorebirds plunge after fish? How could she just up and leave it all? Again. What had it been? 18 months since she'd packed, changed homes, and started another shop, another life, 2 hours east and a lifetime away from Raleigh. No, more than that. It was the end of summer now. It hadn't even been winter then. Divorce was such a harsh word. She'd purposely left it out of her vocabulary, hoping it might never happen. 23 years made creases in a life that didn't just iron out when someone said, "So long, goodbye, I never loved you." Amazing that after years of words, those would be the last ones in a marriage. At the very end, Greg's eyes had said, "I hate you." And here she was, no better off. What had she told herself when he left? That most men were creeps, interested in only one thing. She'd asked God or her own self or something to show her if her thinking were skewed, to show her a man who wasn't a clone of Greg. She'd declared to whatever wall happened to be listening that if a single man of good character existed, one who had enough gray cells to make decent conversation, and who wasn't buying Jags and lacing fingers with teeny boppers, she wanted to meet him. She could still hear her own voice say, maybe not any time soon, but surely before all longings drain out and I become a stick tossed about by the wind. Well, she'd met a man all right, and look how that had turned out. She'd imagined him a gift, but considering the mess she'd been in when she'd first returned to Beaufort, she should have hunted up girlfriends. Sure, Some of the younger women had tried to befriend her, but it had felt like too much work to fit into the happy ever-after world of Tatey and Hannah and all those others. She really hadn't given them a chance, had she? Not after Jack had shown up, grinning past those shades of his. She'd told herself the women were at a different place in their lives, half a generation behind her. Maybe if she lived in town, instead of isolated here at South River, making friends with him would have been easier. She closed the lid to her case and headed to the shower. Turning on the exhaust fan, she undressed with her back to the mirror. She didn't want to see the cheekbones exaggerated from weight loss, or the dark circles under newly sunken eyes. She'd had the same look before, hadn't she? Bony protrusions once softened by flesh. Then, her body had been unloved, untouched by her husband for more than a year. She remembered a time in the spring before he said goodbye when he turned away, limp and useless. She'd chalked up that failure to overwork and stress. She'd even felt compassion for him. What a fool she'd been. It had been overwork, all right. He'd been overworked by Gail's young and very voluptuous body. Now, guilt and regret were the culprits that stole Sam's peace, the things that devoured both belly and breasts. Her legs and arms would be next, anorexia of the soul. She slumped over the sink. It was a long time before her shaking fingers found the shower spigot, and longer still before the sound of splashing water became the only noise that echoed off the tile walls. Morning dawned, and, with it, a profound melancholy. The ties to Beaufort, once so exhilarating, had become shackles. No more tears, no more weeping. It was time. She said her house goodbyes while she sipped a strong latte. With her palm pressed against the back door screen, she stared out over the river. A gull dipped and cawed. A fish jumped. She bit her lip and turned, closing the door, locking it. For a moment, she stood there, her forehead touching the glass panel, one hand clutching her mug, the other still on the lock. Greg's demands had forced her departure from Raleigh, and from the marriage he'd discarded. This time it was her own gotta-haves. That thought brought on the shakes, her too frequent companion these days. She leaned her forehead against the doorframe and repeated the litany she'd memorized. You can, you must, you can, you must. Jack kept calling with messages that said the same thing. Sam, where are you? I miss you. Next, Sam, it's looking good for my return on Sunday. Why don't we sail? And this morning, remember, I love you. Love? Ha! Well, she wouldn't be here to open the door when Jack knocked. Never again would she open her door to him. You can, you must. A knock at the front startled her. Back here, she called as Tootie waltzed in, flashing her bright hair and her wild child clothes, her dangly earrings and lavishly painted mouth, today a burnt orange. What a fortunate day it had been when Tootie's Aunt Ruth had recommended her to Sam as an assistant for the Beaufort Samanthas. Child's real name is Mathilde, Ruth had said, while showing Sam the space that would become her new shop. Maybe it was my son, or one of his friends, who first called her by that ridiculous nickname, but there you go, it stuck. Ruth, the realtor, had also found Sam's cottage, and reintroduced Sam to the contractor who would make it livable. Sam's old childhood buddy, Jack Waters. Sam batted away that last thought. Enough. Tootie was an elf on steroids. Hair that changed color on a whim, earrings that dangled past her chin, clothes and hues that popped, all in a package that included a love of literature, an ability to set up shop windows and shop shelves that invited customers to browse and buy, and a personality that won converts to friendship in this otherwise staid town. All ready? Tootie's grins lighted her whole body, reminding Sam of a mongrel the twins had owned, who'd wiggled loose-jointed from head to tail at Daniel's call or Steffi's laugh. Not that Tootie wiggled, of course. Sam sighed. Jack said that people who were always happy must have a few screws loose. That showed what he knew. Tootie had her screws set perfectly. Sam pasted on a smile as she rolled her big suitcase toward the door. "Here I come. Let me get that," Tootie said, reaching to help. Sam waved her away. "You can practice setting the alarm and locking up." Her gaze swept over her small acre with one final lingering look at the cliff steps. Then she climbed in the passenger side and concentrated on arranging her purse at her feet, unfastening her seatbelt. She wasn't sure she'd have the courage to leave if she had to see her little sailboat again. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Tootie started the car, nodding toward the house. "All of it. You just concentrate on having fun." Fun? If only. "I know you'll do fine," Sam said. And she'd be free, or at least on her way toward freedom. Gravel crunched under the car's tires. Sam angled toward the window, ignoring tears that slipped down her cheeks and dripped off her jaw. Neither spoke until Highway 101 met 70 West in Havelock. Then Tootie said, "It'll be fine. Everything. Alice, the shop, your house. You've taught me so much, and yes, I remember all you showed me yesterday. The electrical panel, the hot water heater, the furnace." Sam pulled a tissue from her blazer pocket and swiped at her damp cheeks before blowing her nose. "That's a lot of responsibility I'm heaping on you. Sam, listen to yourself. You're letting me live in your wonderful cottage, letting Holland take me sailing in your beautiful Alice, which, by the way, he's dying to work on, so you don't need to worry about a thing. And you're trusting me with the shop. You're doing me a huge favor." "It doesn't feel like that from here." "Pooh." As a few drops of rain hit the windshield, Tootie hunched over the wheel to peer up at the sky. "Was it supposed to do this today?" "I didn't think so. Maybe it will quit soon." "I hope." Tootie flicked on the headlights and the wipers. "I told you Jenny's opening this morning, didn't I?" "Ah, business. Good, a distraction." "You still think she'll work out?" "I do." "I hope she understands you're the one in charge." "You made that plain. We won't have any trouble." Tootie shot her a big-toothed smile. "Besides, if she gives me any grief, I'll just sick Holland on her." "That's what I told Rhea. What an image." Tootie steered the Volvo toward Raleigh and asked, as if she'd just thought of it, "Are you sure you don't want me to take you all the way? I could, you know, it's not that far." "No, it's time you met Rhea face to face, and I have some papers to give her. She lives this side of town anyway." Rain streamed down the side windows. Sam willed it to stop before she had to change cars. But the splat patter continued. The wipers swooshed to the right, to the left, and back again in a grating rhythm that sometimes missed a beat when a blade stuck on the glass. A passing car sprayed a fan of water, momentarily blinding them. "What's with these guys?" Tootie asked. "Haven't they heard of oil slicks?" Sam didn't comment. She could barely see the highway, and Tootie's posture made it clear that the girl was nervous, especially when cars zoomed past in this fast zone. But the Volvo held steady. As they approached the bypass around Smithfield, she directed Tootie toward the exit leading to the outlet mall, and then to a parking lot on the west side. "Rhea will meet us here." Her stomach felt fluttery from too much caffeine, or too much fear. She hated the way she was doing this, leaving the world she'd created and heading off like an escapee instead of a woman on the brink of adventure. She shut her eyes again, just for a moment, and tried to conjure the image of a Tuscany landscape that had hung for so long in the Raleigh house as a focal point for dreams. Then she'd imagined traveling as one of four. Not this way, the mama running off to visit her daughter, because she had to go somewhere. Mama the mess. Mama the... No, she wouldn't even think that word. Here? Tootie asked, rousing her. That's fine. Rhea should be along soon. Tootie shifted into park and left the engine running. Reaching into the back seat, she produced a book. I got you this to read on the plane. Sam studied the blurb. Another Theo Anderson mystery. And how very apropos, with his heroine Sophrina sleuthing in the Apennines. She pulled the girl into a quick hug. Thank you so much. You know I enjoy your uncle's stories. She tucked it away in her shoulder bag with her getaway stash. Her ticket, credit cards, euros, passport, and antiquated cell phone, which wouldn't work once she left the States. I wrote Uncle Teddy's phone number in the back, in case you get a chance to call him. I already told him Steffi's in Italy, because, you know, I thought he might help her. Make her more comfortable, having sort of a relation there. I mean, my relation, not hers, and she doesn't know him, but she knows me, sort of, anyway, through you. And Uncle Teddy's great. I know he'd like to meet you both. Thank you, Sam repeated, scanning the parking lot for Rhea's car. All she could think about was escape, not making nice with anyone, even Tootie's uncle. I don't know where I'll be or what I'll be doing, but thank you. If nothing else, I'm sure Steffi will be glad of another contact. I'm gonna miss you, Sam. You will be back in time for the wedding, won't you? You said Christmas. Doesn't that sound wonderful? All the lights, the trees. It's such a perfect time of year. It is absolutely perfect. She touched the young woman's hand as it lay between them. Tootie's turned and squeezed. Rhea promised to be here for you, Sam said, drawing back. Anything you need to know. I'd never have made it without Rhea. She's a darling, you both are. And on that, Rhea's blue van circled, looking for them. There she is, Sam said. Blink your lights. She saw us. Now you stay here while I get my umbrella. I'm not going to have you get wet. Don't worry, I can change clothes. You can't. Between them, Tootie and Rhea managed to transfer Sam in the suitcase with only a few splashes on each. Yes, I know. Tootie held the umbrella over Sam. Stop worrying. I'll email you with details and you'll call me. She leaned in around Sam. Glad to have met you, Rhea. And thank you so much for offering to help me. I'll need it. Not a problem. I imagine Sam's taught you like she taught me. So don't you be worrying your pretty head about the shop. I'll only be a phone call away, and you and me can get to know each other here. Thank you, thank you. Sam put a steadying hand on Tootie's. Get out of the rain and drive safely back to Beaufort. Yes, ma'am. Tootie started to shut the door. Will you please get a phone over there? Fine, fine, now go. The door closed. Sam blew her a kiss through the window, and Tootie blew one back, mouthing, I love you. As her one link to Beaufort splashed out of the parking lot, Sam took a clean tissue and dried the rain from her face. But the wet continued to form in her eyes. I'm sorry to have dragged you out in this mess. I should have flown from Simmons Knot Airport. Where's that? Oh, right. Sam smiled as she remembered her granddaddy's obsession with New Bern history. You probably know it as Coastal Carolina Regional, but my granddaddy knew the Simmons family and how the senator had honored Lieutenant Knott, a Marine pilot who'd been killed at the time Senator Simmons was dedicating the airport. Granddaddy insisted we call it by its original name. Well, honey, I needed to clap eyes on you again before you take off. Rhea pointed the car west. Sorry it had to be like this. Rhea tapped the steering wheel with her long fingers. You got no cause to be sorry. You're doing the right thing. Sam eyed the milk chocolate profile, with its fine nose, round puffy lips, and crinkly black hair pulled back so it stuck out like a fuzzball from the bright red clip that corralled it. The clip matched the shirt peeking from under a tan raincoat, and was just a shade darker than Rhea's lips and fingernails. The tug on Sam's heart tightened. Rhea had been her best friend as well as her employee for so many years. that the thought of not being near enough to hear Rhea's laugh whenever she wanted just plain hurt. "You seen him again?" Rhea asked with a quick glance Sam's way. "Jack?" Sam eased a deep breath between her teeth, slowly so it wouldn't whistle. "No," she said. "It's why I'm leaving today, so I won't be there when he shows up." "Good. Only thing to do, girlfriend, you know that." The memories, images she'd never be able to erase, brought a shudder. Sam slammed shut her eyes and bit the inside of her cheek. After passing a lumbering truck, Rhea eased her van into the right lane again. The traffic was heavier the closer they got to the sprawl of the triangle, but at least the rain seemed to be easing. If Sam rode too long with her eyes closed, the bile would rise in her throat. Focusing ahead, she concentrated on the slower pace of the wiper blades and the hum of the tires on the wet road. Rhea hit the turn signal and exited toward RDU Airport. "You won't believe who came into the shop yesterday." Straightening off the turn, she didn't wait for Sam's response. "Your ex. With her." Sam felt the wince in more than her eyes, but tried not to let it show. Because wasn't she supposed to be over that one? One mess down, one to go. "Have you seen them since Daniel's wedding?" Rhea glanced over at Sam with a martial gleam in her eye that would have boded ill for Gail if she'd been there. Sam almost smiled, until the image of Gail sashaying down the aisle in that miniskirt flashed front and center. Gail entering the front pew with Greg, sliding past Steffi, pretending she cared about Sam's grown-up boy and girl. "No, but I sure remember that diamond she flashed at Steffi." "You mean at you?" "Did I tell you she said she'd bought the suit because Greg was taking her to Italy?" Rhea snorted. "Not now, I hope." "No, Daniel says they've gone and come back." "But I bet you hated hearing that, him taking her on your trip." When she said it, I wanted to claw both their eyes out. Now, Sam pictured the curvy Gail, whose melons pushed out the front of her too tight tops, while Sam was blessed with barely theirs. Gail swished when she walked, and fluttered her lashes to make a point, whatever that point was. "You know what?" Sam said. "I'm almost glad she has him, so I don't have to." Rhea loosed a laugh that sounded like a bark. "I kept my eye on her as she circled the aisles of the shop, oohing and awing. But she did buy a couple of mugs, pick those two with that blue-brown glaze we both like." "Really?" "Yep. Anyway, while I was packing them up, Greg leaned over, whispered to ask how you're doing. And I told him you were great, happy and fine. Best not let him know differently." Sam grunted. "Absolutely not, and I will be." "That's true, you will be. You're a whole lot better off without that sleazebag, or the one who followed." Rhea squinted in her rearview mirror. "Oh, glory, now what?" And she hit the signal to pull off to the side, but the state trooper's car dashed on past. "Thought he might have been bored enough to stop me, speeding or not." "Men." Sam didn't hide her disgust. Rhea laughed. "Bound to be a good one or two out there someplace. But they sure haven't come our way, have they?" "Afraid not." Her thoughts wandered again to her ex-husband's leave-taking. "Did I ever tell you what Greg's parting words were? That he'd never loved me?" "Girl, he didn't say that." Rhea shot her a look of disbelief. "Never loved you? That's not what it seemed like before. Greg may be a creep now, but he wasn't always, was he?" "I didn't think so," Sam admitted. "We had fun in the beginning, when the twins were young. But you knew that Gail wasn't his first affair. Or even his second. Did I?" "Spilt milk." She leaned toward the cold window, longing to pound her head against the glass, as if self-inflicted pain might ease her now. Ridiculous. Hair shirts never worked, except perhaps to make the wearer itch. They certainly didn't expiate sin. "Cheating and lying like my ex," Rhea said. Found out last week. Bry's got 2 babies other than my girl. No. Rhea nodded. The mama of number 2 came calling last Wednesday night, looking for Bry, who hasn't lived with us going on 3 years now. So how come she's searching for him there? The man hasn't changed his colors, not a whit, she said. I know we gotta forgive them, but it's hard. Especially when your sweet baby's bound to want her daddy, Sam said. When did she see him last? Considering he's been dodging support payments these last years, not since she was 2. Poor thing. Least yours were grown before Greg lit out. Rhea paused. I know it broke your heart. He said selling the house would give me my freedom. Who wanted freedom? No, she'd wanted her home, a place for the twins to visit, and for grandchildren to find family. The cottage is better, though, Sam told the window. Listen to us. Rhea's pursed lips puffed out a harsh sound along with a breath. Moving near the coast got you another Samantha's. It got you Tootie, and it got you that pretty piece of land. And me? I got my baby and you and God. I don't need nothing else. The ponytail bounced as Rhea made her point. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but honey, you and me gotta stop this complaining. And who started it? Sam raised her brows, then sighed. I know, it doesn't matter. We're both better off. So, you're right, no more complaining. Amen. And you're about to go on a great trip. Which, Sam said, wouldn't have been so rushed or so necessary if I'd been a stronger, better person. Her tone turned to disgust as the words again showed up in her head. I'm pretty sure I taught the just say no philosophy. Too bad I failed at follow-through. We both know why, Rhea said. I'm hanging the blame on Jack. He's the one had 2 women. He's the one with those smiling ways that suckered you and her. I don't care if he did move out of her house. He's the one ought to have known better. Wouldn't it be comfortable if Sam could blame Jack for all her woes? But her moral compass should have pointed her away from him. Jack hadn't pretended to believe. She had. Rhea's turn signal blinked and blipped as she maneuvered toward the terminal. You just remember to take care of yourself over there, here? You're doing the right thing. Besides, Steffi's gonna be over the moon thrilled. Her mama coming to visit. It was a good thing, her being able to go, what with Daniel getting married suddenly like that. She felt kind of lost, didn't she? Sam pictured it. Her beautiful Steffi, eyes wide with forced gaiety at the wedding, calling Cindy her sister, as if the word had trouble rolling off her tongue. Thank God that the last-minute opening in her school's Italian program had offered an escape route. Something of Steffi's own. The twin thing, Rhea said, as if that explained it all. It did. They were each other's best friend, it's hard. Rhea merged into traffic in the airport roundabout, eventually zigging the van into a place at the curb. She climbed out and came around to open the side door, saying, Steffi'll find her way, don't you worry. I know. Sam hefted her bag to the sidewalk before pulling Rhea close. Thank you for everything. I love you. You take care here and call me. Rhea sniffled, trying for a smile. Yes, ma'am. I'll check in regularly. Sam turned quickly so she wouldn't have to watch the van drive away. She leaned against a wall at the boarding gate. She'd tried sitting to while away the hours before her flight, had even paced from one end of the concourse to the other to work out some of the kinks. Now she just wanted to get on that plane and get this part over with. She studied the folk preparing to fly the friendly skies with her. It sure didn't look like the world's economic recession had caused a slowdown here. Kids huddled around their parents, dropping crumbs and spilling juice. Businessmen and women two-fingered keyboards faster than Sam could have typed with 10 functioning digits. Thumbs flicked over Androids or iPhones. A couple of grungy-looking youths lounged on their backpacks. They called her boarding zone. Her cell phone jangled Daniel's ringtone as she headed down the ramp, but she ignored it until she'd settled in her seat and tucked away her carry-on. This would be the last time she'd be able to use this old phone until she returned to the States. "Mom, get a new one," had been her children's litany. "One that actually does stuff." They called her a technological dinosaur, but she used a computer for all sorts of business tasks every day. She merely refused to send or receive text messages on a phone. That did not make her a dinosaur. Blowing stray hairs off her face, she hunched away from the passengers who'd fit themselves in next to her and slowly punched in the familiar numbers. Daniel's voice hiked an octave whenever he was worried. His, "You sure you're okay?" hit the top end of the tenor range. "You've got a place to stay when you get there?" She watched out the plane window as a train of baggage carts wheeled past. "I booked a room near the Spanish Steps. I'll be fine. And Steffi's waiting for you." They'd been over this, she and Daniel, at least twice. "She will be," Sam said. "I'll head to Florence in a couple of days. I've made all the arrangements." "By train? I heard you have to book seats as well as find a ticket." "Not by train," but she didn't say so. Better he think her safely on public transport than loose on the highways. She laughed quietly. "You've been searching on the internet." "Of course. What do you expect after calling me with 3 days' notice to say you're leaving the country?" At least he'd moderated his tone, sounding more like her in-control son. A business major. Daniel liked things to make sense, especially as he'd lost temporary control of his own life this year. Still, he'd whipped it back into a semblance of order by marrying Cindy. That had helped, and had given Daniel other things to worry about than his mama. "I'll be fine," said that mama. "I have traveled before and in Europe. But not for years, and not by yourself." A disembodied voice announced that they were closing the airplane's doors. "I have to go. We're taking off. Call me when you get there." The tenor was back. "Soon after. You don't want to hear from me in the middle of the night." Sam hit end and held the button down to turn off the phone. Then she settled in to read Apennine Angles and the Antics of Theo Anderson's Heroine. Hadn't Tootie been cute? Hoping Sam would meet her uncle. The likelihood of running into a mystery writer in a country almost twice the size of Florida was so remote that she had played along with the girl's dreams. As far as Sam knew, the man might live down in Italy's toe or heel, which were not on her list of destinations this go-round. She tried to concentrate on the heroine's romp from the Italian Riviera south, as the sleuth followed a thief who'd made off with one of her baubles. But the words swam on the page. The in-flight movie wasn't worth watching. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But memories intruded, no matter how much she wanted to squelch them. Her life had flipped from flat to flat and back to jagged, faster than she could snap her fingers. She was back in the flat zone now, but jagged had been her modus vivendi for much too long. Out of one mess and snap into another, like a magnet attracting nails, that had been Samantha Ransom. She eased her seat back and adjusted the neck pillow she'd brought, then tried to focus on the abruptness of change to distract herself from fantasies of Greg flat on his back in a body cast, of Jack tumbling into the sea, even, please, of Jack's girlfriend, India, bound and gagged. If she let those in, she'd soon hear an imagined siren's wail and a jail door clanging shut. She needed an expletive, a good solid curse to shout out anyone listening. But oh, it was hard flailing against all those years of zipped lips. And a plane over the Atlantic, while providing too much time for reflection, also wasn't the ideal place for an explosion of language. Besides, she was supposed to pray, not blather ugly words. Did she even remember how to pray? So far, her attempts to reach anyone in power had accomplished zero, nada. Exercise was the only thing that calmed the stress, pushing her toward an early grave. And that wasn't hyperbole. Her own mother had worried herself into so many physical ills that she'd orphaned Sam as a babe of 25. No, if Sam didn't relieve these raw emotions in some healthy manner, she'd end up heading that way too soon. She'd like to imagine her own end would be in heaven, but she wasn't sure she rated an entry pass any longer. She popped an antihistamine. Maybe its soporific powers would let her sleep without the after effects of a sleeping pill, and without embarrassing her by being too effective. She'd taken a sleeping pill once on a red-eye across country and awakened to find her mouth open and drool running down her chin. Isometrics helped stave off leg cramps, but nothing else. She plugged in her iPod to tune out the caterwauling of the miserable baby in the row behind hers, and as a distraction from the seat kicking of the baby's brother and the imploring voice of their mother. But neither music nor an audiobook corralled her thoughts. "Can I get you something to drink?" the attendant asked. "Hot water?" She turned down the food tray, but asked for crackers. "Have you got any?" "Sorry, only cookies or nuts." "Nuts, please." The attendant handed her 2 packages of peanuts and the steaming cup into which Sam dunked the chamomile tea she'd brought along. The task of eating 1 peanut at a time and sipping the tea very slowly occupied a few moments of brain space, but not enough. "Hey, you gonna eat those extra peanuts?" the man next to her asked, pointing to the unopened bag on her tray table. Sam looked from the nuts to the man's belly protrusion. "Help yourself," she said, surprised into offering them. Had she wanted to eat them? Probably later. So why couldn't she have said no? Typical, weak and lily-livered. She straightened in her seat. No, that was the old Sam. She wasn't going to be that way any longer. She wasn't? Then what about the peanuts? She glanced over at the man. He had the bag upturned over his shiny lips. Now he was chewing. Too late for the peanuts. Sam shut her eyes again. You must. She would be strong. She would flee from the old and become a new person. She would. Her nose started to clog as her eyes fogged. She sniffled and squeezed her lids against any spills. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you like something else to drink?" the flight attendant said in a bored voice. Sam shook her head, willing him to leave her alone. She didn't want a soda. She hated sodas. Because on that day, that very first and fateful day, Jack had handed her a can of soda, a Pepsi, as they'd sailed Alice, before he'd kissed her, before he'd done more, before she'd let him. First the soda, and then the more. With a deep sigh, Sam pressed the seat back, trying to change its angle so the kid's feet couldn't land a direct hit. The man next to her readjusted his bulk until his beefy arms pushed hers into her lap. His thigh intruded. She edged as close to the side of the plane as she could get, but the thigh followed, oozing under the armrest. She glared at the thigh and switched audiobooks, trying to concentrate on the British reader. When he announced Chapter 3, she realized she'd missed all of Chapter 2. She punched over to music. Why wouldn't that pill work? She wasn't even drowsy. The sky darkened as they sped east, away from her friends and the day-to-day running of her shops. Choices. One always had choices. If only she'd run sooner. Culpa mea. Chapter 4. Jack. Bats in the belfry, suppers on the hook, pigeons taking pot shots. Where is one to look? Jack Waters didn't do churches. They made his back sweat, and his heart rate surge until blood pounded like a jackhammer in his neck. Which meant he must be a fool, standing in front of this one, thinking about entering its frigid darkness on a day when the sun shone and the breeze blew from the right direction. Sun and breeze didn't come every day. He scuffed the toe of his shoe against a flagstone. Yep, a fool or a coward. In or out? Sam should have answered her stupid phone. She knew he'd call the moment he arrived. That he had called. More than once. She was playing it hard to get again. "Excuse us," a young and very pregnant woman said as she waddled past, followed by a man hefting a diaper bag. And a toddler. Jack winced. Obviously, there were worse things than being childless. Poor guy. But a drooling gurgle from the toddler stopped his blood hammer long enough to let him concentrate again. He ought to be on the river, sailing, not standing in front of this ivy-draped stone facade. He was bone-tired and deserved a few hours of fun before he had to head out again. Muttering a word that didn't belong on the steps of a church and would have gotten his face slapped or his ear tweaked if his pop were still alive to hear it. The hypocrite. He pushed open the heavy oak door and sucked in a deep breath, releasing it slowly as he crossed the threshold. She'd better be inside. His eyes adjusted to the darkened entry, then again when he stepped into the sanctuary, where sunlight filtered through the stained glass. "Welcome," a smiling man said as he tried to hand Jack some folded bit of paper. Jack narrowed his eyes at the fellow. Either that dark brown rug thing was a toupee or a bad dye job. Still, Jack supposed he ought to say something back to a face that continued to beam at him like he was some long-lost brother. He waved away the extended paper with a, "No thanks," trying to sound polite but failing. He cleared his throat. "Sorry." No sense getting tossed out before he'd looked around. A keyboard, guitars, and a set of drums showed off up front. What had happened to the organ and choir? Not that he even liked organ music, but that's what he remembered from his last visit inside a steepled building. Had to have been 30-some years ago. He waited until the congregation had seated itself, and he could see overheads. He picked out Tootie's orange hair easily enough, but there was no sign of Sam's brown fluff. His gaze scanned the rows. Wait, was that? An unknown woman sat up straighter. No, she was too short to be Sam, and there was a kid next to her. As the service began, Jack turned and left, his frustration drumming in time to the beat from inside. Where was the fool woman? He'd been phoning the house for the last week, but she hadn't answered. This morning, he'd returned to town just long enough to pick up some papers he'd needed for tomorrow's sale. The equipment in Pittsburgh had been a dead end, but he was on the trail of a good generator that would hit the auction block in the morning. Sam had been a mess the last time they'd talked, blubbering, saying he needed to leave her be. How could he? They belonged together. He'd be able to smooth things over once he found her. Well, that would have to wait. She wasn't working, or at home, or sailing Alice. And she wasn't at church. She never stayed gone long, not when her house and boat were here. So he'd be back, and then he'd find her. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 5. Samantha. If ever I were wanting, if ever I were free, I'd find myself a Chinese junk and sail up the yellow Yangtze. Sam tapped a palm against her thigh, keeping time to the music in her head as she stepped off a curb and crossed toward the Fontana di Trevi. She wedged herself through the crowd to the rail, and there it was, the famous fountain, just as she'd imagined it from the movies. This was good. She was in Rome. The sun shone, the water splashed and bubbled, and she finally felt rested. She ogled the carved figures and all the coins that visitors had tossed in the water to bribe one god or another. Ah, but she, Samantha Ransom, would keep her purse closed. It wasn't a day to tempt fate, and, as far as she knew, God couldn't be bribed. Which really was too bad. Turning from that thought, she checked directions to the Spanish Steps. Her stride lengthened and her limbs loosened, and she tucked the guidebook away in her bag. The scent of baking breads, of garlic and herbs, and of coffee wafted from doors as she passed. Students and tourists perched on the tall steps, some reading, some chatting, some merely basking in the day. Well-dressed women strolled arm in arm. Cell phones seemed permanently attached to more ears than she'd expected. Who cared about Jack or home? Not Sam. At least not at that moment. She had cut loose bonds that had nearly strangled her in Beaufort. She imagined flinging them to the wind. When her stomach reminded her that the chocolate gelato had long since worn off, she stopped for lunch in a little trattoria where the waiter spoke English. Lovely waiter. She studied the menu and asked for a recommendation. He brought her a plate with 4 light, sweet, incredibly succulent mushroom ravioli, dribbled lightly with brown sauce and freshly grated cheese. She moaned at the first bite. The waiter returned. La signora is certain she does not wish a small glass of wine to accompany I funghi, merely the water. Tempted, because after all this was Italy, she said. Do you have a suggestion? Un momento, signora. A smile lit his face and he hurried off. The small glass he gave her to sample was a light red, almost translucent. She'd expected white. Sipping, letting it roll over her tongue, she wanted to purr. Please, yes. He filled her glass and stepped back, obviously delighted with himself. Well, she was pleased with him, too. When he cleared away her empty plate, he asked what she'd like for secondo. 4 large ravioli, and he supposed she'd want more? Fine, she said, a small salad. A couple of very handsome and very young men sipped something at a nearby table. One spoke, an invitation, perhaps. She ignored him. The others lifted glass and toast of Bella, slipped through the language barrier. She appreciated the compliment, who wouldn't? But she'd read that Italian men flirted with anything female, no matter her age. Ducking her head between bites, she tried to emit no talking vibes. No men allowed, no chatting or smiling or speaking, period. Thank you very much. Wine with lunch meant a nap. After her tramp through the streets and her visit to the Colosseum early that morning, bed sounded like a luxury. She left a hefty tip for the waiter and wandered back out into the sun. Her stomach did a little lurching thing, as if it knew home, when she turned the corner and saw the sign for her quaint hotel. Retrieving her key from the desk, she thanked the bent and smiling clerk and climbed the marble steps to the 2nd floor and her room, which overlooked a small courtyard. There, she eased out of her sundress and slid between the cool sheets. Sleep should have been inevitable. She lay with closed eyes until images she'd tried to bury danced across her lids. Jack laughing as Alice bucked on a wave, reaching for her, and India standing in the background, furiously pointing a finger. He's mine. Sam tossed off the sheet and grabbed her book. Sofrina had tracked the jewel thief to Bologna and was hot on his trail. But the words began to jumble and mix with India's voice crying Jack's name, with India's voice screaming Sam's. Oh, God, please. Noises filtered through her window. Siesta had closed the shops. In the interlude, pots clanged and people talked and laughed. Sam wished she could be a fly on the wall, one who grasped this foreign language and could share the humor. Here, in Italy, not there, in North Carolina, in the life she'd left behind. By morning, she'd felt ready to try the touristy bits again. She breakfasted in the hotel's parlor on espresso and a penne al cioccolato, sweet chocolate and a semi-sweet pastry. She could get used to this, and get fat from it. Well, maybe not right away. She still had pounds to put back on before she looked normal. The crisp morning air made the trek to the other side of the city invigorating, and she lined up with the hordes to visit the Vatican. She'd never seen anything quite so awe-inspiring as the Sistine Chapel ceiling, although craning her neck while cheek to jowl with those hordes did nothing for her comfort level, in spite of the guards who stood everywhere, shushing all to silence. She imagined Michelangelo, flat on his back, high above the floor with a paintbrush in his hand. How could he have had enough perspective to create such paintings when he couldn't move back far enough, without climbing down and then up again, to make sure that hand fit where it ought and that robe hung as it should? How had he imagined the scenes? God's finger reaching out, God breathing life, the history of mankind that had led to the coming of a savior, the scenes from Christ's life And there, at the front of the chapel, a crucifix. The death, the resurrection. What hours of preparation had gone into the planning, the drawing, the crafting of a vision that still sent people to their knees. She'd have fallen to hers if she'd been alone. And then a shout startled her, and everyone else in the room. "My money!" In American-accented English, no less. The crowd did its best to part as a guard rushed forward, and Sam could hear the man's words, along with the frightened mewling of a woman who must have been his wife. "Look here, someone unzipped my waist bag. How? I didn't feel a thing." Sam touched the small purse that dangled between her breasts and under her shirt. As she watched the crowd, another worry added itself to her load. Pickpockets clever enough to lift valuables with no one noticing. She exited the Vatican and headed back across the Tiber using un ponte, a bridge, slightly upriver from the first. Repeating the Italian word, she committed it to memory as she stared down at the narrow canal that was the Tiber River. The water looked deep and brown and very unappealing. She tried to focus her attention on the streets, the bridges, the buildings, but a dark head or a certain look, or even the sight of water flowing past, brought a rush of memory. Jack, finger combing his dark hair. Jack calling her to sail, to play, to forget her world of hurt. The trouble with trouble was that it didn't go away just because you wanted it to. Why had she imagined a foreign place would automatically do the trick, as if the miles would wipe clean her brain's hard drive? So she walked, and then walked more. Finally exhausted, she carried a slab of onion pizza back to the hotel, instead of braving another elegant dining experience at a table for one. Perched on her bed, she opened the pizza box and bit into the thick crust. It was laced with rosemary and sprinkled with Romano cheese. She did her best to enjoy all the flavors that zapped her taste buds, putting off those phone calls. They had to be made, and her daughters needed to be first. Steffi asked again when Sam would get there. Soon, Sam promised, unwilling to limit herself to a specific day. She'd reserved a rental car for Thursday, but she might want to stop somewhere between Rome and Florence. An entire country lay before her. Son Daniel must have been distracted by his pregnant wife when Sam called him. Or perhaps he took his tone from his twin sister, knowing his mama had actually made it to Europe and so out of range of his control. At any rate, he began to cheer her on. The conversations with her children had almost worn her out, but her managers needed to hear her voice, or she needed to hear theirs. Rhea answered at the Raleigh shop, her warm tone like honey flowing over Sam. "I've checked in on the girl to see how she's making out. Seems to be fine. We have a date to meet next week. Thank you. You've got no call to worry about either of us. You just take care of you, hear? You know what you gotta do, so stick with it." Sam wrinkled her nose at the phone. "Yes, ma'am." She was trying, wasn't she? "You don't make it back in time for the quarterly reporting," Rhea said. "I'll do it for both stores." Tears filmed Sam's eyes. "How did I ever get so lucky as to find you? Honey, wasn't you finding me. It was the Lord rescuing me by sending me into Samantha's that day." Neither of them would win that argument, because Rhea had always given more than Sam could ever repay. It was probably time to make Rhea a partner, at least for the Raleigh store. The talk with Rhea buoyed her enough to punch in the Beaufort number. Tootie zipped right on past the small talk. "I know you probably haven't had time to call my uncle yet, but did I tell you how to pronounce his name in Italy? They call him Teo instead of Theo. Isn't that cute? They spell it T-E-O, so I guess the E makes a long A in Italian. I should study the language for when I visit him. You won't lose his number, will you?" "I'm sure I won't." Obviously, Tootie wouldn't let her. The girl giggled, reminding Sam how very young she was, barely older than the twins. Had Tootie undone her bright orange hair yet? The one constant delight was Tootie's ever-changing palette. "How's the house? Are you comfortable?" I love it. I'm taking really good care of everything. Holland's coming over this afternoon to work on Alice, and he said he'd take me sailing this weekend. We'll be extra careful. You don't have to worry about a thing. I'm glad he's there to teach you. He's a keeper. Sam wished he could stay at the house as protection for Tootie. Just be sure you set the alarm every night, okay? I don't want anything happening to you. We don't get who might have wanted to hurt you. One sharp-eyed flight attendant? Sam didn't answer, but she had another excuse for staying far from home. The thought that India might escalate damage beyond Sam's stuff.